Our first panel, Left Imaginaries, runs from 9 o'clock, or 8:57, to 10:30.
We're good. We're ahead of time.
We are. I love it. Panels run on schedule here at Money on the Left. So we have Brendan Cook, Jakob Finnick, and Josephine Lee. We will begin, as in the program, with Brendan Cook and his paper, From Greed to Gold, the Personification of Money in Early Modernity. Born and educated in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Canada, Brendan Cook earned a PhD in history from the University of Toronto in 2009. He held teaching positions at the University of Toronto and Carthage College before coming to the University of South Florida in 2013. He specializes in the intellectual history of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
All right, thank you.
We would invite you to individual panelists to come up and present to us from here. Yes.
It's all good. Either way, it works. Okay, well, right, good morning. Really great honor to start this panel off. So I guess I should say, first of all, I wouldn't be surprised if my topic seemed a little bit out of place here, because after all, we're talking about modern monetary theory, and my plan is to take you all into the past. I'm here to talk about the 13th century, and I'm not doing this to explore MMT in strictly economic terms. Instead, I want to go back 700 years to explore the psychology of MMT, or maybe you'd actually call it the psychology of the resistance to MMT. I'm thinking about why, when you explain MMT to someone, their first instinct is to dismiss it. And I'm sure many people here know what I mean, right? You know what happens when you say, for example, that deficits don't matter, or we can have full employment, that government doesn't need to tax to spend. The moment you say that, the other person shuts down. It's extreme, it's radical, it's crazy, it's impossible. It doesn't matter how you explain it, because these things are seen as self-evidently untrue. And I think the reason for this, the reason people doubt MMT reflexively, that's a matter of history. MMT seems impossible because it disturbs a consensus that has existed for centuries now. To take MMT seriously, I argue, you have to be open to ideas that have been out of favor for at least 700 years. It's hard, but it's true. So I think it's valuable to look back. I think it can help us to rewind the tape to a time before this consensus became established. We can rediscover what it was like not to be burdened by all of the assumptions that make full employment, a fully provisioned public sphere, seem like a fantasy. Now, the traditional narrative will tell us that the 13th century is where the money economy emerges in Western Europe. This is when money begins to define daily life, at least in commercial centers like Venice and Florence. Now, of course, according to MMT, you have money already wherever you have taxation, wherever you have the tax obligation. And so people have been already paying tithes for centuries by the time you get to the 13th century. So it would be silly to say the money economy starts then. Instead, let's say the 13th century witnesses a rapid expansion of the money relationship. The regions of Europe, they're becoming increasingly integrated as they rely on long-distance trade. And that means that people are feeling their interdependence across vast regions more acutely than ever before. So, for example, in the year 1100, nobody in the city of Florence would worry about the start of spring in England. No one in Venice would worry about what the weather was like in Egypt. But by 1300, a late spring in Yorkshire up in England spells trouble for the wool industry in Tuscany, which has now become the main industry there. By 1300, Venetian families are depending on grain grown on the banks of the Nile to make their daily bread. And while the tax obligation, this has always existed, it's always been there, it's becoming increasingly sophisticated at this time. The different imports, excises, fees, tolls, all of this, they've multiplied to the point that there's a shortage of notaries and tax lawyers just to adjudicate all the arguments about who owes what to whom. There are new paper mills springing up all the time, but they're always a step behind the demand for charters, for contracts. So I guess what I'm saying is the 13th century might not have reinvented money, but it certainly feels that way to many people at the time. People are distressed, understandably, at the pace of change. And this distress, this anxiety, it gets tied up with a new technology for organizing that social reality, and that's the gold coin. Now, it's true, gold currency was never entirely unknown in Western Europe. There was like Byzantine coins floating around. But it's only in the 13th century, Western powers, Western nations, or incipient nations, start to mint their own gold currency. So, first gold coin in the West is struck in Florence in 1252. Her rivals, Venice and Genoa, follow a generation later. And now, these same cities, they'd only just started minting silver coins a generation or two before that. But gold gets all the attention. And that's by design. Because silver is a local currency. Silver is for local expenses like fines or wages or the fees of tradesmen. But gold is what is used for international commerce and international taxation. So the shipments of English wool and Egyptian grain, that's all paid for in gold. And the Pope, the King of England, the Commune of Florence, all these governments, they consolidate their taxes in gold. So what this means is that gold is a natural symbol of the emerging social order. It's associated with the promise of this increasingly interdependent social reality, but also with its problems. And of course, the 13th century has its share of problems. The cities, you have systematic unemployment. The countryside, you've got the enclosure of communal land. And the expanding bureaucracy, this rapidly expanding bureaucracy, provides endless opportunities for corruption. Things are especially bad in what's basically Western Europe's only universal institution, which is the Catholic Church. Well before 1300, so well before the end of the 13th century, we can trace all the abuses that will lead to the Reformation 200 years later. You have church leaders being chosen for their wealth, not their spiritual qualities. And you've got the sale of indulgences, which essentially means that the wealthy can buy their way out of suffering in the afterlife. And these are all legitimate issues. But it's interesting to see how these problems get articulated. Because there is a shift over the course of the 13th century. There's a shift in the way that people discuss the abuses of the money economy. Over the course of this century, an older style of rhetoric, an older way of talking about money gives way to a new one. And difference basically is this. In the older rhetoric, the misuse of money, the abuse of money, it's given a moralizing treatment. There's a tendency to blame institutional failure on the individuals in charge of those institutions. There's an emphasis on moralizing language, terms like greed and avarice. And this style of rhetoric is already in decline by the end of the 13th century. But there's a really good example, a late example, at the beginning of Dante's Inferno. Dante Alighieri, in case anyone here is not familiar with this, was born and raised in the city of Florence. So he's had firsthand experience of the money economy and the challenges that it brings with it. And so it's no surprise that Dante fills his vision of hell with bankers, bureaucrats, hypocrite priests, right? Well, that's what's on his mind. What's more surprising, though, is where Dante lays the blame for all of this dysfunction that he sees. Despite the fact that he's writing just after 1300, Dante is, relatively speaking, a traditionalist. And so he writes from a perspective that was once almost universal, but is gradually falling out of favor. In the very first canto of the Inferno, Dante describes the forces he sees ruining Italy in the moralizing terms I was just talking about. And he does this through an established symbol of avarice, which is the wolf. Dante describes a dream where he encounters a terrifying she-wolf. He says this wolf, and I'm quoting here, seemed weighted down by every desire in her leanness. Now, I know that image might not be perfectly transparent today, but for Dante's first commentators, it's almost painfully obvious what he means to say. They're all familiar with this contemporary language of poetic allegory where every symbol has a meaning, and it's understood the wolf signifies greed. And these early commentators also agree that Dante's words are intended to illustrate that greed is not just a moral problem, but also a deeply political one. Dante asserts that this sinister she-wolf, and again I quote, he says, "She has brought despair to many a nation." And that's his way of warning that this narrow selfishness of individuals can threaten an entire community. It can become an institutional problem as well. But now Dante, he's something of an anachronism. As I say, this kind of rhetoric Dante uses is already in decline by the time he writes the Inferno in the year 1300. By the time we get to the dawn of the 14th century, this older emphasis on the moral, political character of social problems is giving way to something new. Instead of blaming avarice, this new style of social critique blames the technology itself. As we move from the 13th century to the 14th, fewer writers are blaming greed at this time. Instead, they're blaming gold. Instead of objecting to the abuse of money, they write as if money itself was to blame. And so the gold coin gradually replaces the wolf as a symbol of social evil. And you can see this shift. This shift is embodied perfectly one generation after Dante. So early in the 14th century, probably the most influential figure of his whole generation is a poet antiquarian, Francesco Petrarca, also known in English as Petrarch. Like Dante, Petrarch's a Florentine. He's living in Florence, raised outside of Florence, one generation after Dante. And so like Dante, he has plenty of experience with morally compromised bureaucracies. In Petrarch's case, he spent half his life working as a civil servant for the papacy. And so he's seen it all firsthand. But where Dante is a traditionalist, Petrarch is an innovator. Petrarch's so historically important because he's associated with the emergence of humanism, which is the movement that really defines the coming culture of the Renaissance. And while Petrarch shares Dante's concerns, he's worried about the same issues, he doesn't approach them the same way. When Petrarch describes the Pope's administration, he doesn't just rail against selfishness. He also speaks in terms of the malevolent power of gold. Petrarch has a way of discussing gold that it endows it with a sort of agency. He writes as if the metal itself was somehow working to erode and corrupt human institutions. And to give you an example of what I mean, I actually want to quote one of the public letters Petrarch addresses to the European public early in the 14th century. Now in this letter, Petrarch talks about the Pope's court and the corruption there. He compares it to the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur. He writes that the city of Avignon, where the papacy is settled, is like a great labyrinth full of terrible monsters ruled over by a tyrannical king. The only difference between the ancient story, the modern reality, is that everything that is supposed to bring salvation has failed. The cunning of the hero, the love of his friends, according to Petrarch, all of that's useless. According to Petrarch, all the old values have lost their power in direct proportion to the increasing power of money. This is an important passage, so I want to read this in full. This is what Petrarch says. "Here is the dreadful prison, the aimless wandering in the domain of shadows. Here too the urn, where fate stirs the lot of men. Here the tyrannical Minos and the voracious Minotaur. But here there is no healing medicine, no love, no charity, no promises worthy of trust, no friendly counsel, no thread as a silent guide to mark the twisted path, no Ariadne, no Daedalus. There is only one hope of salvation here, and that is gold. Gold softens the fierce king and pacifies the frightful monster. The guiding cord is woven of gold. Gold reveals the forbidding doorway and shatters the bars and stones. Gold bribes the stern doorkeeper and opens the very gates of heaven. And what is there that gold cannot do when Christ himself is bought for gold?" As you see, that's an amazing passage. It's incredible in a lot of different ways. But nothing comes close to that very last line, right? What is there that gold cannot do when Christ himself is bought for gold? Because remember, this is a profoundly religious culture. Everything gets defined in Christian terms at this time. So the idea of Jesus himself submitting to the power of gold is the perfect expression of the idea that the money relationship has obliterated everything that was once good or right or beautiful. And it's no coincidence, as I was saying earlier, that it's Petrarch and not Dante who we associate with the emergence of modernity. Humanism is one of the dominant currents in European thought well into the 17th century. In some ways, it's with us to this very day. But, and this is also important, it's not just the humanists, like Petrarch, who are beginning to talk this way as we enter the first stages of modernity. The 13th century also sees the emergence of a second movement that helps define the modern moment, and that's the Franciscan Order. Now, strictly speaking, the Franciscans, it's a relatively limited group of men and women bound to live as monks, but their influence extends far beyond this. The Franciscan ideal of a holy life, it becomes a model even for Christians who don't actually join the order. And well, the Franciscans don't always see eye to eye with the humanists. They agree that money's evil. They agree with Petrarch against Dante, that the problem is not the people who abuse gold, but the metal itself. When St. Francis founds the order early in the 13th century, he bases it explicitly on this idea of the rejection of money. Order's original constitution forbids monks so much as to touch a single coin. At first, the Franciscans can't even have a shared bank account just to coordinate their communal expenses. Now, by the end of the 13th century, the most impractical, ridiculous rules, they've been relaxed. So, for example, the order now manages its finances through a special account held in the Pope's name. They raise funds for churches, chapels. And that's the real irony, though. Even as the Franciscans are moderating their actual practice, the rhetoric surrounding money has become more militant than ever. The stories told about Francis and his first disciples, they helped to feed this legend. And in this legend, money, and gold in particular, is the villain again and again. I would say the Franciscans demonize money, but that's an understatement. Because, well, the notion that money's diabolical, that's not a figure of speech for them. There's one story, as is told in the later 13th century by St. Bonaventure, who was a Franciscan theologian. Bonaventure tells how the original St. Francis was wandering down a deserted road, one of his disciples, and they happen on the road to find a purse full of coins. Now, according to Bonaventure, the disciple wants to take the purse and open it, but Francis will not have it. So he tells him, don't touch it, move on. But the other monk keeps pestering Francis. He keeps saying, well, we can use this money to help the poor. Use the money in the purse. So in the end, Francis agrees. He retraces their steps. He knows what's going to happen, but he's got to demonstrate it. The monk's got to see it for himself. And so after saying a prayer, Francis says to his companion, it's okay, you can pick up the purse. And guess what? Before the monk even touches the money, before he even reaches out, he's afraid. He trembles as he feels what Bonaventure calls a diabolical presence. And then, at the last possible moment, out slithers an enormous snake. And no sooner has the snake emerged from the purse than it vanishes, along with the purse itself. Now, just in case that moral wasn't clear enough, Bonaventure drives it home at the end. According to Bonaventure, this is what Francis said to his friend when he saw the snake disappear. Money, my dear brother, is to the servants of God nothing but a devil and a venomous serpent. And that's what unites the humanists and the Franciscans. Petrarch and Bonaventure, as I said, differ on so many things, but on the problems of the money economy, they're in perfect agreement. Both of them reject the assumption behind Dante's vision of the she-wolf. Both reject the idea that money is only a problem to the extent that human beings choose to make it a problem. Instead, they insist that money is somehow intrinsically destructive. And even when you set aside the moral and political challenges posed by greed, they argue that the money relationship will always be problematic. And that brings me back to the start. to the relevance of all this for MMT. I began, remember, by saying that the claims of MMT are often dismissed as crazy and irresponsible. And there are a lot of reasons for this. A lot of reasons people reject MMT. But in this context, I'm thinking of one in particular. Whether you talk to people on the left, the right, the center, you get some version of a common refrain. Whether you talk about taxes or employment or deficits, all three ideologies give you some variation on a similar answer. In one form or another, they'll all say something like this: money just doesn't work that way. You all know what I mean, right? You hear this from centrists who warn you about inflation. You hear it from neoliberals who just object to any manner of regulation. And you will hear it, I hate to say it, from a certain kind of Marxist who is convinced that injustice and exploitation will persist as long as money does. If you propose a radical reform in the money relationship, you'll be told it's impossible. And you're told it's impossible because of the very nature of money. Won't allow it. You can never use money to actualize our wasted social potential. You can never do that because money doesn't work that way. And for me, that is what sounds familiar. Whenever I hear money treated as an unaccountable force that acts according to laws outside our control, I recognize this. I recognize this because I've heard it before. Whenever I hear money described as if it has a mind of its own, I think of Bonaventure's serpent. And whenever I hear someone build money up into this all-powerful thing that can't be managed, that can't be legislated, I hear Petrarch saying Christ himself is bought for gold. Because in some sense, we are all inheritors of Petrarch and Bonaventure. We think and speak as we do because they won and Dante lost. We doubt MMT because we've renounced the insight concealed in Dante's image of the she-wolf. We've turned our back on the idea that money can work for us instead of the other way around. And so for me, the next natural question is why? Why did we give up on the promise of the 13th century? Why did we restrict ourselves to the limited horizons of the humanists and the Franciscans? Now that's clearly a question for another time, but I do want to leave you with the following quote from the great American socialist Eugene Debs. I wanted to include this because I saw it very recently. Thanks, Mikey. I saw this very recently on the Democratic Socialist Facebook page. I think the fact that this quote is being shared by socialists today, it sums up the predicament of the modern left all too well. It exemplifies how we are still living in the shadow of Petrarch and Bonaventure. This is what Debs says: I am for socialism because I am for humanity. We have been cursed with the reign of gold long enough. Money constitutes no proper basis for civilization. The time has come to regenerate society. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Brendan. Next up, we have Jakob Finnick, whose paper, From Occupy DC to Occupy Wall Street, Why Was There No Empowering Popular Understanding of Money After the Crisis of 2007 to 2009. Jakob Feinig is a historical sociologist who interrogates the intersection of money creation. Let me say some nice things about it. The intersection of money creation and electoral democracy. His work looks at the ups and downs of popular participation in monetary politics in the United States from the colonial period to the New Deal. Dr. Feinig has published in Sociological Theory and the Journal of Historical Sociology and regularly presents his research at national and international conferences. He is working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled, How Much Money Should We Print This Year? Popular Participation in American Money Politics from Colonialism to Neoliberalism. And on related articles that endeavor to enrich the sociological understanding of money from the perspective of popular knowledge and democratization. A former Fulbright scholar, Feinig holds degrees from the University of Strasbourg, the University of Vienna, and from Binghamton University. Without further ado, Professor Feinig.
Thank you so much. So Brandon Cook has offered 700 years. I'm going to offer 82 years and 5 months.
How precise.
I made up the 5 months, that's not true. So I promised to answer the question, why was there no empowering popular understanding after the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009? And to do so, I will first introduce a framing I have found useful and then turn to my historical narrative. And I'm going to talk very briefly about Paulo Freire, who once wrote that popular silence about matters of supreme collective concern can be understood in relational terms. He writes, this is a quote, "Understanding the culture of silence presupposes an analysis of hierarchical dependence as a relational phenomenon that gives rise to different forms of being, of thinking, of expression, to those of the culture of silence and the culture that has a voice." So there's a hierarchy between, you know, a small group that monopolizes power and knowledge and a much larger group of disempowered actors. The large majorities who find themselves excluded from decision-making and authoritative knowledge. For Freire, any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry and understanding is one of violence. And from that perspective, I think we should understand monetary silence as institutionalized violence, even as a form of dehumanization, because naming, understanding, and transforming the world are the proper destiny of humans. And these activities are what make us human from a Freirean perspective. A culture of monetary silence is a denial of transformative imagination and possibility. It's a silence that disables critique and the development of alternatives. The people in this room might question that we actually live in a period of monetary silence, given that there's all kinds of debtors movements and all kinds of public debates around M&T especially. But I think if we situate today's debates as part of a larger and longer historical trajectory, we can better understand why the popular response to the crisis of 2007 was so muted. In my book manuscript, I addressed two long waves of politicization and silencing in North America. The first long wave starts in the late 17th century and ends with the Constitution and the de-democratization enabled by it. In this talk, I focus on the second long wave of politicization, and especially the end of this period, which coincides with the early phase of the New Deal. I then discuss this end of the politicization in relation to the neoliberal present and in relation to the possibilities in the present, in order to enable a deeper understanding of the context in which we operate. So the agrarian movements after the Civil War, greenbackers, populists, bimetallists, are well known. They were dominated by white men, but there were significant alliances across the color line. There were also significant advances in terms of including women in political action. Political analyses of unemployment, especially populist analyses of unemployment, are not as well known, but they're as important. Coxey's Army, for instance, an extremely well-publicized movement of unemployed people led by Jakob Coxey, put unemployment on the table, and at the time that meant breaking a taboo. There were no unemployment statistics, and white men had only recently gotten used to the idea that unemployment was, that wage labor was a fact of life, so unemployment was not really on the political horizon, and for sure it was not seen as a structural problem. This is based on a book by Jerry Prout that came out recently. So in the US, there's a deep historical connection between recognizing the structural reality of unemployment and critical monetary thought. Most commentators think that money politics were over in 1896 with the defeat of William Jennings Bryan. Other people think that it was over in 1913 with the establishment of the Fed. I suggest that monetary silencing was only effective in the early 1930s. And this is why I think that is a better periodization that helps us understand the present better. Farmers reactivated populist knowledge in the slump after World War I, and with the onset of the Depression, popular groups and allied politicians mobilized greenback-style monetary knowledges to oppose the gold standards. They deployed this institutionalist understanding of money to press for public spending, debtor relief, public cash, and credit in a context of deflation and unemployment. They all supported FDR's campaign, his first campaigns, and he accepted their support. Many and probably most of the groups that pushed for extending socioeconomic rights, from veterans movements to the Townsend movement to agrarian groups and Upton Sinclair's gubernatorial campaign in California, they all articulated their demands in the context of an institutionalist monetary analysis. They attempted to modify existing institutions to finance their demands for cash and credit. They had many allies in Congress, including Elmer Thomas and Wright Patman, who either personally knew populists or were themselves connected to populist movements in the past. Some were genuine allies of insurgent monetary knowledge producers, others bowed to pressure from back home, which again points to the breadth and depth of critical monetary knowledge as late as the 1930s. The bonus army is especially important. It was modeled in part after Coxey's army. Coxey tutored Patman, who was one of the informal leaders of the movement, both in terms of organization and in terms of monetary theory. They demanded the early payment of a debt the government owed to them in a context of hardship. It's difficult to imagine a more potent symbol of the unity of the political and the economic than unemployed veterans squatting in front of the supreme lawmaking body demanding the issue of paper money. So this distinction between politics and economics just completely crumbles as thousands of veterans engaged in this form of direct action. They dismissed the gold standard and saw it as a weak excuse for denying them assistance. So this is why I think 20th century money politics is not over in 1913 or 1896, but in the 1930s. How did New Dealers respond to that? New Dealers rode the wave of popular pressure. They fulfilled some of the demands of these, again, primarily white male groups. They stabilized access to money. They in different ways, they created social security, they created, they paid the veterans bonus, created the GI Bill for veterans, in addition to all kinds of credit facilities. So they enabled access to especially privileged groups of white men who had previously not had this form of stable access. But while they did that, they also avoided engaging critical monetary thought. And they consistently opposed congressional money creation. So they managed to overcome the Depression and finance the Depression, even go after gold standard without politicizing money, and in fact, by increasing the depoliticization of money. In his radio addresses, FDR encouraged listeners to relate to fundamentally reliable and unquestionable monetary institutions. He explicitly compared the federal government to a household. And he also introduced the distinction between fiscal and monetary policy into a period in which the gold standard has been suspended. So he recycled sound money thinking, and he brought it into a context where there was no more gold convertibility. So that's why I think that New Deal changes were subtle, on the one hand, because people, when they received their checks or their benefits, they rarely complained that they had been disempowered, or that they did not complain that they were being deprived of their monetary knowledge and monetary, critical monetary attitudes. But they were also very important because the effects of the long-term and medium-term effects of granting demands while repoliticizing money was a depoliticization. It was monetary silencing. More broadly speaking, as several political theorists, including Iris Marion Young and Aziz Rana, have pointed out, New Dealers weakened participatory politics and the aspiration to popular, but always primarily white and male, control over the organization of the social institutions like money. And political questions were redirected to questions about distribution. Iris Marion Young calls this the distributive paradigm. To quote Rana, the public as an active and continuous participatory presence had been recast as the recipient of security protection from economic threats. So New Dealers changed the rules of popular engagement with money, subtly but also durably. They restructured the character of popular involvement in money politics. After World War II, there was a split in money politics. There was, on the one hand, most constituencies who claimed a strong voice in the public sphere did so by adhering to the New Deal paradigm. And this is based on Greta Krippner's recent article on the democratization of credit, and also on work by Soderbergh, who they claim that this idea that groups that were excluded by the New Deal, and also by Fordist modes of access to cash, black communities, women, when they demanded access to credit, equal access to credit card, and also in the context of the community reinvestment movement, when they did so in the idiom of rights. They wanted to extend the New Deal forms of access to groups that had been previously excluded. They did not repoliticize money in a way that went back to pre-New Deal forms of money politics. So public claims about money came to be framed in terms of access, not in terms of direct institutional control. When creditor practices became colorblind and genderblind, they did not cease to be racist and sexist. Women gained access to credit cards. Creditors invented a nominally gender-blind way of credit scoring. So now everyone was equal in the role of credit, when in fact that was merely a way of hiding the continuing unequal access, given the underlying forces that ensure that women have lower credit rates than men. So the victories of black and feminist groups enabled color and gender blindness, but also pushed for democratization. In the post-war decades, economic theorists also succeeded in creating a realm of monetary expertise that insulated highbrow money politics, all the kinds of knowledges that are about institutions, about mechanisms of money creation, from popular intrusion, deepening the idea, which was shared by gold bugs but also by New Dealers, that money production ought to be disconnected from democratic publics. If a government prints money, Milton Friedman said, legislatures needed to enact strict rules to achieve a government of law instead of men. So that's sort of the epitome of what happened during the post-war decades. This reading of the New Deal and neoliberalism makes it possible to think about neoliberalism as more than a simple opposition to the New Deal from a monetary perspective. Instead of rejecting it wholesale, neoliberals selectively draw on the New Deal legacy, delegitimizing some non-credit forms of access to cash while building on the absence of popular participation. Right? So neoliberalism is not simply a rejection of the New Deal, but it's building on some elements, maintaining some elements while removing others. Therefore, from the perspective of popular involvement in money politics, the current situation is unprecedented in US history. New Deal and Fordist modes of access to cash are being chipped away, while institutionalist forms of popular knowledge have been lost. And I think that New Deal and neoliberal forms of monetary knowledge, practice, and power survived the crisis of 2007-2009. Despite important gains made by Occupy, it failed to systematically connect to the idea that money is a creature of the law and potentially a creature of democracy. It's very interesting in this context to look at David Graeber's own account of Occupy Wall Street in a book called The Democracy Project. And in this book, he situates Occupy in relation, or rather he fails to situate Occupy in relation to contentious money politics from the 18th and 19th century. So he himself had a very long-term structural understanding of debt as a critical aspect of society, and by his own account was in direct and frequent contact with audiences who asked about things like the Jubilee or student debt Jubilee and stuff like that. In the book on debt, he promoted a deep historical view of debt, but he did not connect at all to the rich history of debtors' movements in the US and their practices of occupation. Most strikingly, he states that even the idea that Occupy could be situated in US history had not occurred to him until several months after the occupiers had been evicted, when he made a speech at Federal Hall about the Bill of Rights and found his reluctance to grant it. He had not, this is a quote, he had not been thinking of Occupy Wall Street as rooted in any grand tradition in US history. He then adds a chapter about the Constitution. He's completely silent on Big P populism and its immediate inheritors in the Great Depression. And there's an amazing quote, which is really, he says, historically, those who have successfully appealed to class populism in the United States have done so largely from the right, and they have focused more on professors than on plutocrats. So this is really an amazing distanciation of a popular movement from the popular movements in the past, who, with all their silences and omissions, are they do provide interesting blueprints and also inspiration for movements in the present, and also they provide legitimacy because it shows that money politics is not something that that needs to be invented from scratch, but that there is a popular genealogy. It's also interesting how Occupy, at least in Graeber's account, relates to the Great Depression. I think it was limited to the Hoover versus FDR dichotomy, because we can look, for instance, at Bloombergville as one of the precursors of Occupy. The name implies a very specific relation to the New Deal, because Bloombergvilles, that they borrow their name from Hoovervilles, right? But Hoovervilles embody despair. They don't embody political action. They don't embody participatory politics or direct action. So the fact that Bloombergvilles were more present than the Bonus Army, which was the actual Occupy DC in 1932, is very interesting, and it's very significant because it shows that it appears that the only two options that are there is either Hoover or FDR. There is no third option. And because they point to this gold standard fanatic, they talk about the name Bloombergville implicitly talks about is a critique of Hoover and Bloomberg. They implicitly call not for participatory politics. They call for an FDR. Distinct from the predecessor movements of Occupy, that and austerity were not connected to a coherent, widely shared and insurgent vision of what money is. Rooting Occupy in paper money politics would not necessarily have meant romanticizing or idealizing any of these movements, but it would have meant reconnecting to their electrifying insights and their successes. From this perspective, Occupy is, at least in part, an unwitting inheritor of New Deal silences and omissions relative to money. Overcoming neoliberalism from this perspective, and I'm going to read a few more sentences, would not simply mean demanding more rights, such as access to the widely debated guaranteed minimum income. It would also include a deep and popular understanding of what money is. From this perspective, the job guarantee, which is advocated by modern monetary theory movement, is much more promising than a basic income because its proponents systematically include public education in their work. And I think that such an effort allows citizens and inhabitants to rethink the popular relation to money and wage work. And if such a job guarantee were to be established together with a reshaped popular knowledge about money, this would be much more than a repetition of New Deal achievements. In fact, it would make a neoliberal or austerity backlash more difficult instead of enabling it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. Next, we have Josephina Lee, who's going to talk about a community currency powered job guarantee. Jo Lee is a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Her field of study is ecological economics, and she is working on her dissertation on how to use teaching of alternative philosophies and community currency-powered job guarantee schemes to help our society transition onto a more sustainable path. She currently teaches economics at Bemidji State University and also coordinates their North Star Visiting Scholars Academy. Please welcome Jo Lee.
Good morning. I'm very glad that I'm going right after Jakob. I think it flows very well. Your concluding statements that we need to combine job guarantee with the knowledge of money is exactly what I'm proposing here. So this is a policy proposal for the Indian nations, a community currency-powered job guarantee. It's not unknown that the Indian nations suffer severe economic problems, poverty, but because the Indian population is such a small percentage of the US population, it is often not talked about. Although we know that unemployment, poverty, lack of meaningful economic opportunities contribute to other societal problems. So without looking at the whole picture, we're not realizing the connection between the drug problem they're suffering on the Indian reservation, the high crime rates, all of that is associated with the economic problems. So if we can solve the massive unemployment, we can also solve the other social problems. So the Indian nation has definitely had it worse, and it cannot be stereotyped away. These phrases of such as Indian on Indian time, right? That's a rhetoric to stereotype away the fundamental economic problems rather than seeing them as just a characteristic trait. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs their report in 2005 indicates an unemployment rate of 50% on the reservation. One of the problems with finding data on the reservation is that the reservation themselves don't really like to report their internal data for fear of being stereotyped as being on Indian hours. And so in 2008, Murray did some county level data study because in Minnesota and North Dakota, there are a few Indian reservations that encompasses the entire county. So by looking at the county data, we can get a pretty good picture of what is happening on the reservations. So he sampled 5 reservations that showed one of the reasons for declining retail services is that earnings are flowing out of the reservation rather than coming in. In fact, annually there's about $6 million being lost or leaving the reservations. I currently teach at Bemidji State University, which Bemidji is the head of the Mississippi water, and it's in the middle of a triangle where the Red Lake Indian Reservation, White Earth, and Leech Lake reservations are located. So it's right in the middle of 3 pretty large reservations. And in the Walmart in town, we see tons of Native people shopping there. In fact, there are very few local businesses on the reservation. They always come in town to shop. And when they get a big federal grant to start manufacturing jobs or for other purposes, the money usually, again, it doesn't stay. So as soon as the grant money runs out, they go back to ground zero where the problem is still there. According to the White Earth, one of their own economic reports, the official unemployment rate still stands at over 25% and over a 12% decline in retail trade. There's high unemployment, declining retail trade, low education attainment. There's only about 0.1% of the population, U.S. population that hold, or of Indian population that holds a PhD degree. White Earth reports that after the construction of Shooting Star Casino, which many of you that know that one of the more popular economic development strategy for the Indian reservation is to build a casino. So they were trying to look at and see if there is indeed economic development after the construction of this casino. While seeing some increase of sales in arts, crafts, and entertainment, there was still no decrease, no drop in unemployment rate. So besides the serious outflow of earning, the Indian countries also faces the problem of lack of financial capital, lack of human capital, which we can see from their low education attainment, and means to develop those human capital. So, and there's also poor and mismanaged natural resources, competition from non-Indian markets. So these are some additional problems pointed out by Cornell and called in 1992. So we ask, why not propose a job guarantee on the reservation, right? That's the whole idea, is to give the jobs to those who need the most from the bottom up. And if there's more than 25% of people unemployed, that would be a pretty good place to start. So Murray, after analyzing the problems on the reservation, and there are currently two approaches to solving the Indian economic problems. One is call it the standard approach. The other one is the nation-building approach to economic development. For any of you that are not familiar with the Indian Reorganization Act, that's the main piece of legislation under that's the foundation of the state standard approach. The Indian Reorganization Act attempts to solve the perceived Indian problem by means of acculturation, assimilation, and termination. So make the Indian people just like the rest of the white, Western people, then their problem would go away. If by acculturation, assimilation, it's not enough, then we can terminate them. And for some Indian scholars, they argue that the termination continues to go on in the form of political and institutional marginalization. And we're facing a whole generation of Indian populations that know very little of their culture, and the language is also lost. And that's also part of the assimilation, because children were taken away from homes and sent to boarding schools where only English is taught and only Christianity is allowed to be practiced. So there's at the university I teach, there's a whole effort of trying to bring back the native language called Ojibwe, spoken by the Ojibwe people. And since it's a oral language, it's passed down literally from generation to generation. So the effort is trying to come up with a system, a phonetic system, so we can turn it from an oral to a written language and preserve the culture. So that's the standard approach, obviously not going to work. The strategy exclude the Indians from decision makings, and the strategies are also made very short-sighted, often lots of sales of natural resources and land, and ignores the tradition and culture. The other one, the nation-building approach, while seen as more promising, promotes tribal decision-making and self-determination, so it's incorporating the Indian people themselves in decision-making. The actual economic development policies they came up with mostly still centers around capital acquisition, such mainstream free market concept of profit maximization, building casinos, the efficiency, all of this benefits the capital investment rather than the Indian nations themselves, and certainly not the citizens of the Indian reservation. So Murray proposed a job guarantee funded by the US government. What I find a little bit problematic is that here's a quote from his article. Rather than promoting self-determination, nation-building efforts results in indirect attacks on tribal sovereignty, both when the acquisition of finance comes directly from the U.S. government and from private markets. So I see a bit of a contradiction where he calls, from U.S. government, and then the proposal was a job guarantee funded by the U.S. government. So when you talk to the local stakeholders, that immediately becomes a non-starter, and also it's not politically feasible for such a job guarantee program to take place. And again, they're a very small population. And with everything that's going on in DC, they're probably the least on their mind. So politically unfeasible, such problem, even to the problem Murray identified himself. So similar to our speaker Forstater, he had an epiphany in 2012, realizing that waiting for the politician from top down to implement something might take a little too long. So instead of waiting for them, why not form a complementary currency or a local currency or community currency to fund such job guarantee program? So this program would be taking anyone willing and able to work, and involves the tribal government and community to come up with the work that needs to be done. It's always a challenge to try to balance politics at the federal level and the local needs. So in the meanwhile, it's better to be doing something than nothing. So using the concept of MMT, tax-driven money, what I'm trying to do is to theorize and design a local currency. There already exists a vast literature on community currency, complementary currency. And while some of the authors are aware of the MMT movement, doesn't seem to be the dominant culture in the community currency literature. So what I'm really proposing is for the two to talk to each other and take insights and learn from one another. So MMT is going to be the theoretical foundation of this currency I'm designing, and it's also going to be the financial foundation for the job guarantee. So that's what I mean by powered, community currency powered job guarantee. And just to make it interesting, I went to the Ojibwe language dictionary and looked up what money is called in Ojibwe. It's called junia. So I'm calling it junia. While most of the MMT literature focuses on the sovereign currency of a nation and its unlimited financial capacity, neo-chartalism teaches us those are essentially government IOUs. And the acceptance of a government IOU, which is a fiat currency, derives its value from its ability to impose tax obligation and a universal debt on its people. So looking at majority of the community currencies, most of them don't really have that tax obligation component, and which is why we see a lot of them being very short-lived. And then we also know this from the anthropological and historical perspectives. Graeber also highlighted in his book. These perspectives have always shown that money has always been more than a lubricant of transaction. It's debt, it's a credit, it's a tally. As we continue to draw attention to the evolving views on money over time, reflecting changes in the political and ideological perceptions, money on one hand, we know money is not merely a lubricant for an economy. It arises out of necessity to ensure it's smooth. It does not arrive its necessity from the ensuring of smooth functioning. Money serves more than a lubricant. Money is not a neutral factor. It's a product of constructed social and political institution, and the characteristics of which actively shapes and give definition of our economy. So realizing all of that, and realizing that we can, in fact, take control of the money and make it work for the people, understanding as such opens up the possibility that we can use this social technology to design, to produce, to control in a way, to work for the people, and to make it long living by incorporating and learn from the MMT literature, imposing tax on people in its jurisdiction. So I did look up some legal documents. There are a lot of issues with taxation on the Indian reservation, even though they're viewed as sovereign nations, but they do have to follow a lot of other laws of the federal government. So as long as the business and the people on the Indian land and it's also Indian owned, then they do have the ability, the tribal government does have the ability to impose tax. And also in the community currency or complementary currency history and many of the experiments around the globe, two of them stand out to me, the Brixton pound and Bristol pound, both of which has incorporated the tax component in their implementation. The city or municipality allows part of their city tax and fee to be settled in the form of Brixton pound and Bristol pound, two cities. So they were two very successful examples. And for any of you who are familiar with the UMKC Buckaroo and the Denison DVD dollars, they are experiments done in a classroom setting where the professor is essentially the monopoly issuer of the currency. And once the local government imposes a tax on the household, it creates a demand for the currency. And usually in the article, the author states, in this way, the community currency will circulate in the local, in the local region. What I also want to add to that is, in reality, it might be a lot more complex. And we learn that from reading the community currency literature. That's where I think their insights could come in, especially in the case of Indian nations. There are costs associated with implementing these regimes. There are administration costs and just little details. I'm glad to see that there will be some discussion on digital currencies, but with the developments in technology and payment apps and phones, there are some communities who are allowing, instead of paper tally tracking, they're allowing people to use the currency on a payment app, making it a lot more convenient. Like Polanyi's double movement, complementary currency have formed in response both ideologically and practically as political forms of resistance, as well as social responses to cyclical crises and failures arising under capitalist economic growth. So even though there seemed to be lack of knowledge of money, even though it seems like we continue to try to monopolize the money institution, but individuals at a grassroots level continue to create what's not there, right? If there's not enough money to meet the needs, they create something to work for themselves. It's designed to meet the needs of its defined communities. So we've seen there's a lot of different objectives when you're designing these currency. It could be to promote sustainability. It could be to promote alternative livelihood. That brings the equality component, right? Women traditionally provides more services in the care economy, which are not really monetized. So it could also bring equality by monetizing these traditionally gender-related services. And Dittmer in 2007 categorized these existing community currencies into 4 categories: the LETS, local exchange trade system, time banks, hour currencies, and CLCs, convertible local currencies. He examined these 4, and while recognizing that some of them do a good job increasing eco-localization, promoting some of the things I've already mentioned, they all suffer low trading levels. They're drenched in mainstream conventions. There's limitation in the range of services that are provided, usually low skills, lack of social inclusion in the case of those convertible local currencies, still be able to convert at will to US dollars. What they don't realize is what's already been discussed and put out in the MMT literature. So that's where I said the other way around, they should learn from MMT. The currency should not be convertible, and there needs to be a public monopoly, so the LETS system where anybody can essentially create the money by going into debt or providing a service is not going to be as long-lived. So it needs to be debt-driven local currency. That's the potential solution, which a few authors like probably can't say their name right. Leetier in 2012, Peacock in 2016 have also recognized. So understanding that modern currency have broadened the range of missions and objectives that are meant to achieve utilizing advances in computer technology and networking to do so. This is kind of my step-by-step proposal of how this is going to go into effect, the Junia. Tribal government would start by imposing a household civic tax and a tax on business as well. So I want to add or emphasize a little more on the business aspect. Some of the things that has been proposed focuses more on the household, right? Once they are being imposed a tax, it will go into circulation because there's a demand for it. I want to add that we also need to focus or target more on the businesses, on the business aspect, so that local businesses were more willing to accept this currency. The tax on the business could be a flat fee or on a gross receipt. And at the beginning, I suggest that the entity, tribal governments, should target businesses with products with higher local components, such as services, restaurants, healthcare, beauty services. The higher the local components, the more likely they can, for example, pay their employees in this currency. They're more willing to accept it if most of it can be quote-unquote recycled in the locality. There will be some need for, to initially kick it off, we need some financing in a national currency, US dollars. So in order to buy capital that, for example, cannot be produced locally, and this is kind of a sidebar, but the funds can be generated by a solar commons. So I have another colleague who's working on the concept of solar commons. So there will be some solar money generated, and I'm suggesting, we could use that to kickstart such the Junia community currency. And we need to set up a trustee to do three things. One, to compile a list of jobs. For example, housing improvement, construction, cleaning up, building, hiking and biking trails. And I got some of this idea from reading one of the White Earth report. They did a survey amongst its residents. What are some of the things you like to be done on the reservation? And many people responded that they want more hiking trails, they want more fishing piers, they want more recreational activities, and simply there's no money to do that. Right? But if we don't have it, we can create the money to do those things. And for example, Torkids is a little town in Belgium. And they started their community currency with community gardens. So there's many pockets that are already doing on track to do these things, and they provide tons of creative ideas for us. The other thing is the list of skill sets and services that are provided by the job guarantee participants. What are some of the skill sets that they come in with? What can they contribute? So we can match them with the list of jobs that need to be done. This trustee also need to provide some banking service for payments and transaction, and it could be digital. It also needs to play the role of tax collection and community currency purchase with US dollars. So if someone else wants to come in and maybe buy the fresh produce produced by the local people, they can purchase that with US dollar. And an entity has to do that, and that's where the administrative cost comes out. And number 3, the role of trustee is to facilitate interaction between businesses to encourage long-term relation between these small, medium-sized enterprises. And this is a lesson we learned from the Berkshire. And that's why I said I want to focus not only on the household part, but also on the business sides. If, say the local coffee shop realize that it can get its, maybe not, coffee is not a good example. Coffee beans are not produced in Minnesota, right? But local restaurants, there's a lot of ones that like to use locally sourced material. There are lots of, eggs. We have a short growing season, but we do grow some things. And if you promote these relationships in, maybe social events between the small local businesses, the more they can source from each other, the more robust the local currency junia will be. And simultaneously, we'll start a job guarantee program, offering anyone willing and able to work the opportunity to earn junia by performing the list of jobs set up by the trustees. So at the same time, you're also addressing the unemployment issue. So I'm hoping that the income earned by these job guarantee participants will be able to purchase goods and services from these local participants, right? Because early on, we've already worked on talking to the restaurants, the healthcare, maybe the beauty service, salon. These are, probably the first group of businesses that will be willing to accept the currency. Hopefully, they can use that to pay for those services and then also settle their tax obligation to sell to those who need but do not want to perform those work, to buy goods, services that is the output of the job guarantee program itself, and trade amongst community members that would otherwise be too expensive to buy or too expensive to provide at all. Job guarantee and community service, community currency are, they're a natural pair because they share their objectives, they share their visions, and they share the beneficial impact. They both democratize services and organization, and they can continue to provide public provisioning for the community. And we know that when there is a lack of public provisioning, the impact is suffered disproportionately. They both aim at community building, supporting the local economy. Their ability to counter inequality and social exclusion for job guarantees by directly helping the most disadvantaged. For the community currencies by supporting alternative forms of value and alternative livelihood. They both addressed environmental impact and encourage eco-localization by promoting local trade and consumption. And if we add the solar piece, it also promotes the local production of energy. And also promotes shorter production and supply chain. When you get the small businesses talking, that's what you can accomplish. And directly performing environmental services and resource management, that is something the job guarantee can do. And lastly, it can strengthen tribal sovereignty. So going back to the critique to the current nation building and standard approach, right? It encroaches on the tribal sovereignty. I'm trying to end with a quote. So this is not only necessary to the successful implementation and longevity of the community currency imposing the tax, but it also promotes sovereignty of the Indian nation. After all, here's a point made by Felix Cohen. One of the powers essential to the maintenance of any government is the power to levy taxes, and that this power is an inherent attribute to tribal sovereignty, which continues unless withdrawn or limited by treaty or by act of Congress, is a proposition which has never been successfully disputed. So there it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. So, Brendan, do you know who Mansa Musa was?
No.
He was the emperor of Mali in the 13th century. And supposedly, well, not supposedly, he made 2 pilgrimages to Mecca from, this is the empire of Mali. So it's, all of West Africa, pretty much. And on the pilgrimages, he gave away so much gold that, it threw global. Anyway, this is around, did I say the time period? This is just after the period that you're talking about, which I found everything you were talking about so interesting. I know nothing about it, but it struck me that maybe there's some, because you were talking about the rise of the gold coin in that period, and I am, wondering about maybe there's some link between, what was going on after, certainly later on, when you have, like, post 1492, then you have a tremendous amount of gold and silver, looted by the Portuguese and other Europeans out of not only, Africa, but, the New World or whatever. So you have that aspect of things as well. Can I just go down the table so that... So I was really glad, Jakob, to hear you mention Coxey's army. I think that is really important. So it seems to me that there might be a pre-33 part of the Roosevelt administration, and then after, I don't know if it's 33 or whatever the year is exactly, but this connects to Joe's as well. You had lots of script all over the United States being produced by communities that didn't have enough money, and they call it in some of the literature tax anticipation script. Basically, it's tax-driven money. But I think the federal government put a stop to that, and they also put a stop to the proliferation of neighborhood and community unemployment councils, which is very much on the, so you said something about the, I forget how you put it, but the more activist oriented versus the, I don't know, so the WPA, that part of the New Deal and so on, that was part of, I think, the story about that you were trying to tell there, about what the concessions by the federal government under the not to have these neighborhood unemployment councils and the community currencies, that kind of a thing. So Joe, yeah, I'm really excited to see you develop this, further, and you're very kind in only mentioning my name, when you had nice things to say, and then just referring to an anonymous author when you were criticizing me, and also criticizing your husband, who's not here to defend himself, but that was done very diplomatically. So anyway, I think, it's, I thought the Bristol pound was fixed to the UK. No, Bristol, Bristol pound or whatever it was. I thought it was fixed to the UK national currency. I could be wrong. And that was maybe one of the problems. Josh Ryan Collins writes a lot, and I think he helped set that up. And he's very active on social media and stuff. You can get in touch with him out of the New Economics Foundation, NEF. And yeah, I mean, I was really excited to see you start to, I mean, it looks like it could be, you know, a real proposal. I'd be interested if you discussed it at all, because I know you're in touch with some of the people through, you know, the school and so on, and I don't know, Winona LeDuc and people like that, like if what their reaction, you know, would be to that as well.
Does somebody want to respond?
All right, well, okay, let's go down the line. What you say about, you know, perhaps the circulation of gold across northern Africa, things like that, well, obviously, to have these currencies, you have to have an adequate supply of metal, and there is no coincidence that gold coinage starts to be minted again, exactly what it does, although the explanation I've heard is actually China. There are all these new stores of gold mining, of gold in China, and it takes about 40 years for that to get to Europe, but it absolutely does. And then later in the 14th century, the big thing is actually silver, again being found in East Asia. And again, it takes about 2 generations for it to migrate across to Europe, which then causes all sorts of problems because silver currency and gold currency, they're 2 different currencies, and it causes all sorts of anxieties when the supplies of the metals used to make them change. So maybe, perhaps, I've never heard of Mansa Musa, but yeah, certainly in the context of, it's a worldwide thing, the supply of any metal like this, any commodity that's used anywhere.
Just a quick follow-up.
Oh, please.
Do you think the fact that these metals are coming from outside contributes to the story that they're evil?
That's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. The idea of it as being something alien. Well, certainly they're seen as novel anyway. They're seen as novel, maybe not as foreign, but the idea of novelty itself is considered frightening, considered dangerous. But above all, the thing with gold, I think even more than where it comes from, because even with silver, most of the metals coming from elsewhere, silver isn't scary because it's local. Silver is used for local transactions, local taxation, so people feel okay about it. What they're anxious about is how big and complicated the world is getting. And the gold, because it's used in this way, is the symbol of how big and complicated things are. And so that kind of economy that's developing, where people are placing their worries, gold becomes the focus, I think, for that reason.
Lift, don't slide.
Oh, sorry.
So just very briefly, so I think that those municipal capital currencies, they were very connected also. The neo-populists, they connected them to federal money. They said, if a municipality can do that, why doesn't the federal government do it too, right? So there was, and it's part of a broader, very widely shared popular knowledge in that period, I think, that, you know, it can happen at all levels. And what I meant by the participatory, depression era politics is on the one hand the localized one, the tax-driven one, but also the awareness that the federal state can be politicized and democratized. So and to see it as a feast.
I gave my husband a chance to defend himself last time. Interest. Yeah, there's a lot of local interest. When I talked to Winona LeDuc, who is at the White Earth, and she has an NGO called Honoring the Earth, she's very interested in something that both fulfills the economic needs and the sustainability issues.
Right.
And Tony Troyer, who has written extensively in anything related to Indian culture, I went to one of his talks, and in it everything that led up to when he talks about the problems that they face, he kind of brushed on money, right? Them not owning their money. So they do recognize that being a problem, and I asked him, what is the general view on creating your own new money. He's all very into it. There's a way in the sunlight of having something that can be implemented. Yeah, and this would be, I think it would be very exciting because we've done MMT type of local currency, job guarantee only on very small scale like a classroom, or the other one comes pretty close to Argentina. What we can do is, on the Indian reservation, and there's three, so the three could engage in intertrade or adopt a common.
That reminds me, the Patacon in Argentina in early 2000s is another that was accepted in payment of taxes, because you said these ones were, yeah. So you might want to add that, yeah, Patacon, yeah.
Other questions for our panelists? Okay, we got.
Hi. So I was curious. I work at the Seminole Hard Rock Tampa, tribal-owned casino. I was wondering if it would be a possibility to see like a tribal currency be used in gaming operations at some point. Like casino bucks or something like that.
Do you mean like by itself, or this local currency be used in the casino for gaming?
That local currency would be like Seminole-owned currency that would be used exclusively in the casino for gaming, and then on travel reservations. But people would have to exchange American currency in order to gamble for the travel currency.
I mean, we already have that in a lot of gaming facilities. You buy the token, but it's good, right? But it has to somehow tie into that entire setup with the tax obligation. And yeah, I could see that being one of the places that this currency could be used, because there is a big local component in the production of casino services. A lot of the people they employ are local. And yes, a lot of Indians themselves also gamble, but that way at least the money will stay on the reservation because they're gambling with their own money. But the whole problem I have with casino is it kind of deteriorates the tradition and culture. So that's why I don't think it's part of the nation-building approach, but in itself, as an economic development strategy, it also, again, just deteriorates the culture and their identity.
Big casino fans in this crowd.
Thank you. I have a question for the last speaker, because I also come from an Indian reservation called Spain. That is a reservation that belongs to Germany right now. And we don't know how to get out of this trap, And I have talked to many people that is talking about local currencies for whole countries like Spain or any country from South Europe. The problem I see there, and I think it's the same problem you might have with the currency of the reservation, is how what is the exchange rate you are going to use for the local currency related to the US dollar? Because are you going to let it flow? Because if you're gonna pay, you're gonna be able to pay taxes in that currency, but at the same time you are not producing a lot of goods, so you are gonna need to buy goods that necessarily have to be paid in US dollars. You have to be very careful there because you're very dependent, and at the end of the day, I think that you might have such a debt or a level of debt that you are not going to be able to pay for it unless you only use that currency, meaning if at the end you have to leave the US dollar currency and only adopt that currency. And in that moment, you have full sovereignty. In that moment, you have another country inside your own country. because if you're very dependent and you necessarily have to flow that currency and buy goods and services, a lot of them, in US dollars, the only way you are going to have to pay for that is to only use your floating currency. And then I don't see any difference between having a local currency and a national currency. At the end of the day, you need monetary sovereignty. So that's why I never supported this kind of solutions for the south of Europe. But actually, I think the only solution available is leaving the euro and having your own currency, because this problem with the exchange rate, I think it can be unsolvable if your dependency is too high.
Just as a side comment, Germany has hundreds of local currencies. In your opening remarks, you said you're a colony of Germany or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Germany doesn't have a lot of currencies.
Yes.
Which
So look, maybe we have limited time. Maybe we can get a response from Joe.
I mean, the lesson that we learned from MMT is that the exchange rate has to be floating. It can be pegged, it can be convertible. And the strength of this currency, I think, is there will be a strong demand for it because of the universal tax obligation piece. All the households in the area will essentially need some of that currency. And the piece about connecting local businesses and to try to shorten the production and have as many things produced locally as possible feeds into a lot of the problem that current complementary currencies suffer, which is low trading volume and limited services provided. Right? But the more you can produce at a local level, the stronger the currency will be. And whatever you can produce really depends on the resources that are there. So one of the biggest problems the Indian reservation face, I see, is actually lack of human capital. Because you do have 50% of unemployment, but they will have to be trained, right? So part of the job guarantee could also be used for job training. So they can produce goods which then can be purchased with this currency. So again, I do see that there are produce, restaurants, a lot of local services can start with that. And I did mention that you do need some national currency to kickstart the program. And this is where I think the solar comment piece comes in. You can use solar to generate energy, which then gives you some money, because any positive energy produced, right, you get a credit from the energy company, right? So that gives you a nice reserve, right, for initially anything that you need to purchase that can be produced locally, like big capital, John Deere tractor or something like that. And it's never meant to completely replace the national currency. It's meant to be, complementary to that. And also from a lot of the examples that we've seen in the past, for the same public provisioning services, it's produced for much cheaper in terms of national currency using complementary currency, right? In the Tokaret example, the municipal government only provided plots of land. And then as a result of their local currency, produce were made, but in addition to that, care were provided, like giving rights to seniors at hospitals, a lot of services that if the municipal government were to fund would cost them more in terms of national currency than if you did it that way.
Okay? Yeah. All right. Well, if you would join me, please, in giving a round of applause for our